thank you, Thomas, who is also a friend as much as he's a brother. And I'm totally humbled, I think, by the generous introduction. Uh, it sounds great, but I'm not that great. So it's just part of that, academic journey that, one has to experience and pass through in one's life. So anyway, I must begin by thanking the Whitehead Research Forum for giving me this opportunity and for their timely thought to share uh, on a topic which is very, very critical and at the same time very, very contemporary. And all of us know, what is going back home in Manipur today. I assume that most of us, may be from Manipur or might be from Manipur. Uh, I don't know the format, how the forum has, organized talk in the past. So, and personally, I am not good in speaking in many language eloquently. So I am raised in a Mizo family, but we are bilingual. We use Mizo also, we use Paite also. And then I studied in a Mar school. I speak a bit of Mar. And so my life is a kind of a salad. So when Tam was asking me, whether you'll be comfortable to speak in Mizo or anything, then it is okay with us. But then when I'm thinking, in what language should I deliver, then I have to fall back to English not because, I am confident in English, but I think this is the, only language that I think, I can communicate more effectively than any other language that I know. Thanks to everyone, coming online on a Friday evening. And my sincere thanks, before I go into the lecture, my sincere thanks to all the research participants with whom I have been doing this work for some few months or maybe years now. The lecture or the talk is based on something that has, that is currently unfolding largely in the context of Indo-Myanmar borderlands. And it is something that I have been, thinking, or I should say this is a thought in progress. So my lecture may not be very, very smooth, but then, I would be grateful to receive any kind of comments, suggestions, as well as criticisms. Kam, would you mind sharing the slide, please? So the title of the talk is From Non-State to Statelessness, Understanding the Contemporary Refugee Crisis of the Zo People. Right? So if you can just go to the first slide. Can you just scroll it down? So yes. So I wanted to begin by, this question, which is how do we understand the contemporary political crisis of the Zo people? And this question is posed in the context of not only what is happening today to the community at large, but also for a community who has long exposure to violence and who live under perennial condition of violent othering. How do we make sense of this current political predicament which is being faced by the Zo people? So to do this and not to, answer the question as such, but I find that, or I feel that the concept of border precarity is helpful to understand the contemporary situation of the Zo people. Now, I use this border precarity to exemplify the uncertainty that define the life of the Zo people, the fear and risks associated with their social, cultural, and material well-being, to live and lead a dignified life as a community. Next slide. So, to explore this question, I have two broad arguments. The first argument is the making of the Zo as a precarious people. Second is the making of the Zo as a persecuted minority. Now, The coming back to the first argument, which is the making of the zoo as precarious people. So this making of the zoo people as precarious community can be traced to the gradual loss of their existence as autonomous people. Now, this is not to paint a romantic picture of the zoo people past in terms of existing as a sovereign or autonomous people uh, in time immemorial. So the time frame that I have in my mind is the pre-colonial period. Now, one work that has particularly inspired me is James Scott, particularly his book, The Art of Not Being Governed, now, which came out sometime in the year 2008. Now, in James Scott formulation, the hill areas, were which is now popularly known as Zobia, were non-state spaces where communities escaped to the hills and refused to be incorporated within state system. To Scott, Zomia is a place of refuge for the people of South and Southeast Asia. The hill communities toward the entry of the state and the cultural markers through which the lowland or the valley inhabitants label them as primitives are actually adaptations designed to evade both state capture and state formation. Now, basically, in Scott's formulation, one central aspect that is evident, particularly in the context of today Northeast India, is the hill and the valley, what in Manipur we call the hill and the valley divide, or in Scott term, lowland and the upland. Now, Scott observed that there has been a friction between the lowland and the lowland and the upland. And this friction is determined by the way in which the people who are inhabiting the uplands refuse to be part of the civilizational state. However, if we look at the contemporary political condition of the Zomia Highlands, we can also see that much of the Zo Highlands or the Zomia Highlands have ceased to exist as a non-state space today. And in fact, many Zomians have themselves become part of the state or are state seeking. Now, by saying that they cease to exist as a non-state space, basically is to say that the modern state has successfully penetrated into the Zo inhabited areas or into the Zomian Highlands. And today, many communities belonging to these Zomian Highlands are seeking a state of their own. For example, in Mizoram, Mizoram is a state. It's a federal state. It's not an independent state. It is a federal state, but it is a state. And in Manipur today, we have many different facets of those struggles, maybe by different armed groups that somewhere demand state to be incorporated under the state. The other aspect of my argument is the making of the Zo as a persecuted minority. Now, minority persecutions, when we talk about minority persecutions, largely in the context of South and Southeast Asia, mostly it is framed within the logic of uh, communal identities, particularly in reference to Hindus and Muslims. Now, this is not surprising given the population, given the demography of South and Southeast Asia. But then what we see today is that this a predominant idea of uh, persecution of minorities is no longer limited to Hindus and Muslims alone. Now, today we're seeing a lot of minority communities across South Asia and Southeast Asia facing uh, persecution. So I advocate this idea that it might be helpful to think about the Zo people as a persecuted minority in contemporary times. Next slide. So can you just stop here? Now this is Zomia. If I'm handling the slide, so I could have shown it when I was talking about James Scott. Now this is Zomia. So it encompasses probably 8 to 9 countries. There are more than I think 150 million people who are inhabitants of this Zomian Highlands. Come the next slide. Now, what do what do I mean by border precarity, and why do I use this term to unpack the contemporary situation of the Zo people? Now, precarity as a concept is something which is not new or recent to social science literature, and many of us who are in the domain of social science definitely might have come across the term precarity. So particularly in sociology, the term precarity has a very long history in the work of, say, Karl Marx, who talks about alienation, Max Weber, who talks about bureaucracy, and Emile Durkheim, who talks about anomie and the study of suicide. However, these classic sociological thinkers, they do not necessarily use the term precarity in their work, despite the fact that their work largely speaks to the precarious condition of industrial working class, or largely people who have been swept away by the changes brought about by industrialization. So, in my case, my intellectual foundation or my thinking is largely shaped by the idea of Bourdieu, Hannah Arendt, Michel Foucault, Judith Butler, and Guy Standing. Now, the term precarity is largely invoked to describe the condition of being vulnerable, instability, and uncertainty. So, for example, one of the sociologists who have used the term precarity and tried to describe it in depth was Bourdieu. In his study of rural Algerians, noted how the lives of Algerians were defined by chronic anxiety the next day, where they were kept absolutely incapable of calculating and forecasting. And for these people, Bourdieu notes there is nothing solid, nothing certain, and nothing permanent. Now, the feminist sociologist Judith Butler also talks about precarity, and in her understanding, precarity is something which is pervasive in human life because we are interdependent, and this interdependence has made us precarious being in many ways. Now, uh, the, a good example of precarity is academia. Now, many of us started our career in contract jobs. I myself has started my career in contract jobs. And when you are in a contractual position, it's very difficult to foresee the future, whether you will get permanent post. You always have this tension and this anxiety. Now, the idea of precarity is largely used in the context of labor regimes, or to understand or to understand the condition of the working class. But today, the idea of precarity is being used across different domains of social science. But one scholar whose work has really popularized this idea of precarity is Guy Standing in his book The Precariat, A New Dangerous Class, that gave an impetus to the study of precarity, noted how the precariat is a combination of both precarious and proletariat. Now, the new understanding that Guy Standing advocates is that precarity is not something which is limited to the working class or the poor. Precarity can be experienced even by the middle class, by the lower middle class, or the upper middle class. So today what we have is a situation where precarity is everywhere. So scholars study precarity in the context of labor, in the context of migrants, in the context of youth, academics, so on and so forth. At the same time, precarity is also used as an umbrella term for communities who are marginalized and whose existence is defined by risk, insecurity, and dispossession. Used in this sense, border precarity is representative of the existing realities in borderland regions of the world. Now, why do I use this border precarity, and why am I interested? Specifically because despite the fact that the idea of precarity has been used in different domains of social science, it has not been used and adopted in the context of borderland studies. Now, how do we engage with communities living under perennial violence? How do we engage with communities living under perennial violence? So, one is that, border precarity is helpful because borderlands are not always violent spaces. There are periods of calm, there are period of stability. At the same time, there are also periods of prolonged violence. So violence is something which is not a permanent condition of borderlands. Now, for example, even in the context of Northeast India, many borderlands or many other borderland regions in the world, what we see is that violence is not something which is a permanent condition. But then there is always a sense of vulnerability that is being experienced by people living in the borderland regions. Now, in the context of the Zhou people who are inhabiting these vast, borderland regions extending from Indo-Myanmar to Indo-Bangladesh, what we see is that there is this perennial condition where they are being exposed or vulnerable to experiencing violence. Now, I use border precarity to engage with the lives of communities living under prolonged violence. In borderlands, one finds multiple forms of precarity that relate to insecurity, risk, vulnerability, and dispossessions that can extend from being detained, deported, killed, displaced, and even made stateless. The use of border precarity is timely in terms of how borders across the world are increasingly becoming zones of conflict, with rising geopolitical tensions and increasing militarization. Now, if we look at today borderlands, not only in Europe and North America, even in Asia, border regions are becoming extreme sites of violence as well as militarization. At the same time, this violence and militarization also accompanied the restriction and control of movements and mobilities across and between borders. One is that national governments across have imposed new regimes of border governments by introducing new ways of controlling population movements, such as biometric surveillance. In the case of India, we have seen how there is a continual attempt to digitize people's identity to Aadhaar card or to various other means. So by and large, precariousness in border regions is defined by the uncertainties associated with state policies towards the borders, from opening and closing of borders, deportations, and targeting of borderland inhabitants. In the context of a borderland where lives and everyday living are precarious, violence only deepens precarity. In this conceptualization, the idea of precarity is not merely an exceptional condition, but one that views precarity as a way of life, a common human vulnerability. I have 20 slides, but many of the slides are images, so I won't take a lot of time to go through them. Now, before going to the contemporary situation in the context of the Zoe people, so let's just have a quick overview of the refugee condition at the global level. Now, globally, refugees are emerging as one of the fastest growing precarious class. According to the UN Refugee Agency, at the end of 2011, there were 89.3 million refugees, a majority in Asia and Africa, with another million asylum seekers awaiting decision. Now, one of the reasons why I wanted to talk about this global scenario is that there are 5 countries in the world which contributed to 69% of refugees, and among them is Myanmar. So Myanmar contributed 5% of global refugees today. Now, these refugees, suffer from multiple precarity. One is the fear of being detained. There is always a risk of lives, economic exploitation, and human rights violation. Now, the Myanmar scenario. So, according to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, in the since the post-coup violence, there are 21,348 people from Myanmar who applied for asylum in other countries. However, if we go back to the political history of Myanmar, since its independence, we have seen that there has been uh, conflict between the minority ethnic communities and the Myanmar state. So it means that Myanmar has seen a lot of internal. One is a lot of internal displaced people. Second is a lot of refugees who have fled conflict and violence in predominantly in countries such as Thailand and Malaysia. Now India is also one destination, but then Thailand and Malaysia are one of the countries, two of the countries that has seen large influx of refugees. So refugee camps in Thailand are located along Thailand's border with Myanmar, while refugees in Malaysia reside mostly in Kuala Lumpur. The majority of refugees from Myanmar are from various minority ethnic groups within the country, such as the Chin, Kachin, Karen, Mon, Rakhine, Shan, and Wa. So if you look at these statistics, one interesting thing is that many refugees from Myanmar began resettling in the United States in large number around 2008. So on the left side of the table, we see how the number has been quite stable since 2008. From 2008 to 2014, approximately 1,09,000 Burmese refugees arrived in the United States from camps and urban settings in Thailand and Malaysia. So, as Kam was, briefly mentioned about my postdoc in the United States. So, I had the opportunity to meet a lot of Myanmar refugees who are now citizens of the United States. So, many of them also have shared me their experience of their migration from uh, Thailand or Myanmar to United States. Now, if you look at this border, this is the Myanmar-Thailand border. So, the red dotted which are the red arrow or the red marker, which are dotted in the borderlands, are the refugee camps. So these refugee camps, are not just temporary makeshifts. They have been, quite permanent now, and generations and generations of ethnic minorities have been living in these refugee camps. If we can go to the next slide. Now this is a refugee camp in Mizoram today. Now, even if we look at today contemporary Mizoram and Myanmar border, we will see that the border is dotted with refugee camps from the north to the south. So there is no many refugees does move into the interior part of the state, but then from Zamphai to Lunglei to Siaha, what we have is that today many of the refugees have been taking shelter on the Mizoram side of the border. Now there has been a lot of to me my opinion or my idea can be quite contested. But there has been a lot of demonization that is happening against refugees, and there is also a lot of myths that is being circulated, particularly in social media. So some of them, this is not an exclusive list. Many of you might have, many of you might have also known some of the myths that are being circulated about refugees. One is refugees as a homogeneous group. Now there is this very convenient labeling of refugee as Burmese, basically in the context of Mizoram, for example. So anyone from Myanmar, anyone from Burma, they are uh, projected as Burmese. And needless to say, there is a lot of racial profiling that is being attached to the idea of Burmese. Second is that there is this idea that refugees are poor and they are poverty stricken. Third, refugees are engaged in criminal and illegal activities such as transporting Burma bomb like drugs, guns, etc. Second, fourth, the other myth is all migrants are refugees. Now, anyone and everyone who cross the border are refugees by default. So these are some of the myths that I often come across not only in social media but even in conversations with people both in Manipur, Mizoram, and elsewhere. Now, beyond the myth, beyond if we go beyond the myth, we see that there has been a lot of cross-border interdependence, and this cross-border interdependence extend beyond ethno-history, such as like the myths and the folk tales that we talk about. This cross-border interdependence has to do with marriage. People get married, across the borders, and there are familial as well as skin connections between people living in Myanmar as well as people living in India. The other cross-border independence is narco and ethnic nationalism. Now, if you look at Myanmar, many of the ethnic armed groups are heavily involved in or drugs trade. Now, today in Manipur, also what we see is that when we talk about illegal trade, we tend to talk about illegal trade as being perpetuated by people coming from Myanmar. But then what we have today is a situation where many of the armed groups are also engaged in what people in Myanmar call narco nationalism. There is another aspect which is legal and illegal trade. Now, what is legal and what is illegal is quite contested. Now, if we look at the agreement between India and Myanmar, then the kind of goods that can be traded between the two countries is very very minimal. People trade a whole lot number of goods. Despite this, it is undeniable that many people in Manipur and Mizoram are heavily invested in commercial trading between, particularly from Myanmar. So in Aizawl we have Burma Lane. In Churchandpur there is Burma Store, and many of us like love what we call Burma Nekhe, right? So there is this cross-border interdependence that has been always happening, not only at the level of ethnic identifications, but also at the level of economy. And another is that these migrants from Myanmar made up one of the largest pools of the underpaid class. For example, in Mizoram, they are known as Burma Thingzai, and today in Manipur and elsewhere, even in India, there are a lot of maids who are being employed not only in Mizoram and Manipur, but in different parts of the country. Now, the one important aspect of precarity is to understand the process in which precar- re- people are made to suffer from precarity. So I have a problem in pronouncing R, so I'm not going to pronounce that because I tend to lose my flow. Now, one is to understand the process. I think to understand the process, the first point is precarity is not a choice. No one, no, no human being or no individual wanted to live or desire a precarious life. Second is the formation of the nation state is in many ways respond or contribute to the precarious existence of these old people. Third is precarity is not only experienced by people from Myanmar today. Precarity is experienced even by people, by the Zo communities, particularly in Manipur. Now, coming back to the first point, precarity is not a choice. Violence in the Indo-Myanmar borderlands is forcing thousands into precarious conditions in existence. Much before the post-coup violence, Mizoram has seen a high inflow of migrants and refugees seeking political asylum or using the state as a transit. Myanmar has one of the largest populations of refugees in Southeast Asia, and they are largely found to have lived in neighboring countries such as Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, and Malaysia. Communities, irrespective of their ethnic backgrounds, live in precarious conditions. There are more than 3 million migrants, mostly undocumented, mainly from Myanmar in Thailand. Now, by saying that precarity is not a choice, basically is to say that people don't move out of their home in their own will. Many of either they are being coerced to move out, or either they move out or migrate or flee from conflict and violence. Now, it is also important to outline that the violent condition or the violent experience that today Zo communities are facing in Domem, in the Chin State or in the Sagang region, is something which is not recent. It has been happening since the post-colonial formation of Myanmar state. Now, coming to Bangladesh, today the Zo community in Bangladesh are also facing a very unfortunate situation where they are being forced to take shelter in the northeastern state of Mizoram. Now, in Bangladesh, the formation of the new nation state, followed by Islamization of the country, where the new nation state have taken on the idea of religion-based national identity. So, what follows this is there is a mass erasure of the country's Adivasi population, particularly in the Chittagong district, through state-sponsored demographic engineering, basically where the state is promoting Bengali peasants to settle in Chittagong district, and militarization, which is happening at a rapid scale in CHT, and suppression of democratic rights. So the Zo people in Chittagong district face dual hegemony, one from the dominant hill communities and second from Bengali communities, the country's majority population. This has produced a new form of precarity, refugees who fled to Mizoram. Now, the third aspect of precarity is the current precarity or precarious existence, which is experienced not only by refugees and migrants, but by Zo communities in their own homeland, particularly in Manipur. All of us, might have seen or heard what is happening currently in Manipur. So over the past few years, what we have seen is that there is an incessant targeting and labeling of the Zo ethnic groups as refugees, and which is followed by a mass victimization by the state, resulting into the violation of human rights, destruction of properties, and displacement en masse. How much time do I have found? 15 minutes?
Yes. Go ahead.
Okay. So, I will just like to, quickly highlight or locate the current condition in Manipur. So, in the context of refugees, one of the most significant marker is the use of camps. Now, in Manipur, in its history, I don't know to what extent government has been using camps to detain and imprison refugees. But in recent times, we have seen camps coming up in various districts of the state. So, in many ways, the use of camps, in a more broader sense, resembles what the Italian political or philosopher Agamben called the state of exception. In the idea of the state of exception, the central idea is that people who live in an area of exception does not have a right. So their existence is reduced to bare life, basically people without rights. Now, camps have been used to mark out the space of the illegal, the unwanted, the rejected. Now, for example, the most common example which is often cited in the context of the use of camps is the period of Nazi concentration camps. But then if you look at the global landscape today, the use of camps is far more popular, not only by authoritarian governments, but also by different types of governments. Now, we see what China is doing in Xinjiang. We have seen what Turkey is doing in the Kurdistan region. We have seen what the United States is doing in Guatemala, so on and so forth. So camps is something which is quite universal in terms of its utility. So today there is this push for biometric surveillance in the form of linking voter card and Aadhaar card, and a push to map the tribal lands through conducting survey, collection of demographic data. And the use of camps, enable the creation of two types of people, citizen and denizen. Now, citizens are people who are considered to be legally entitled to rights, civic and political rights. Now, in the case of denizen, are people who live in the camps. They have a right to live in a place, but they cannot enjoy any rights economically and politically. This legal distinction has become evident in states such as Manipur and Mizoram. Now, so by and large, I try to depict one side of the precarious existence of the Zou people. Now, the other is this precarious existence because of the encounter or because of the violent experience. Specifically, this is quite prominent when it comes to the Zou people in Myanmar. So in Myanmar, the last 2-3 decades has seen, a push for Burmanization as a policy, social, economic, and cultural, and at the religious level. So ethnic minorities in Myanmar, such as Karen Chin, largely belong to Christians, including the Chins and the Mizos, and their religion is projected as foreign and an enemy of the state. In Bangladesh, similar forms of marginalization are experienced by Hindu and Christian population, leading to a gradual decline in the population of the religious groups. Now, this point is important because when we depict refugees as Burmese, they're quite unhappy. So I'm going to talk about it in the later part of the slide. Because they are communities who have rejected the idea of being Burma or Burmese. So the struggle of the ethnic minorities in Myanmar has a lot to do with the rejection of the dominance of the majority Bamar communities. Now, in 2011, after the post-coup violence, there has been, a mass counterinsurgency that has been taking place in Chin Hills and the Sagang region, and which is one of the worst affected region of Myanmar. And one of the most important or critical aspects of the counterinsurgency in Chin Hills and the Sagang region is the striking parallel in terms of the way in which violence is being undertaken. Now, most of us might recall the wholesale violence that was being used against the Rohingya communities in Rakhine state of Myanmar. Now, what the military junta did is that there is a wholesale destruction of habitats. There is a wholesale destruction of people, and many organizations, particularly international NGOs, have come out saying that this is nothing less than a genocidal attempt. Now, the kind of violence that that was undertaken in the Rakhine state is something which become evident in the context of Chin Hills and Sagang region. Most of us might have seen the kind of aerial bombings that have been undertaken in Palam, Halkha, Thantlang, and many other regions. So the method deployed by the Myanmar military is demonstrative of its attempt to demolish and deprive not only the rebels and civilian protesters, but also implement wholesale violence through aerial bombing that target homes and burn townships and villages. So I wanted to talk about I am not going to analyze some of the narratives that I have pasted here. So I think in talking about the refugees, it is important to bring into focus what refugees think about themselves. How do they make sense of their current political condition? So this is an interview that I have that we conducted recently. So let me just read out. In the wake of the civil disobedience movement in Myanmar, it no longer felt safe to be staying there, and it is terrifying because I'm a government servant and also a part of CDM, civil disobedience movement, and we can be summoned for inquiry anytime. My fear would be regarding the security status here, as many of us have been caught already by the armed forces or the police. We can be caught anytime because there is a slight difference in the language and it's not hard to tell. Despite the fact that we are all from the same ancestor, we are often termed as Burmese by some people. It might have been better to hear if they tweak their narrative about us as Inpite from Burma, because we are not Burmese, even though we are from there. Even in Burma, we are identified as Chin, Kachin, Zomi, Rakhine, etc. Calling us Burmese is a way of them treating us as foreigners. For example, we won't call them Indians or White if they come to Burma. Instead, we will treat them as our brothers and sisters from India. Them calling us Burmese is like calling them as Vaite, which is wrong. Kam, can you please go to the next slide? So this is another narrative from one of our from a research participant. The political unrest of Myanmar is one thing. The main reason of me fleeing my home country is for the education of my two younger siblings who are in class 7 and 8. And we are not certain for how long will education centers in Myanmar be closed because of this situation. The main objective of us coming here is rather for them to get education and knowledge. As long as livelihood is concerned, as far as livelihood is concerned, I was told that it is manageable if you are healthy and hardworking. Even if we can't find decent jobs, we can tell livestock, and that has motivated me a lot. The first time when I came here from the side, I even felt emotional because local people near the checkpoint say that even if we speak the same language, we are still Burmese at the end of the day. Even though we are from Burma, we are not Burmese, and we don't call them Paike, but instead Zomi from India. So when they call us Burmese instead of Zomi from Burma, it's not enough. It's enough to make us feel bad emotionally. The fear of being arrested by Myanmar military forces is no longer there, but we're still worried that Manipur government may arrest us because they frequently did that and gave us to the hands of the Myanmar military force. Now, in both the narrative, there is a multiple level of precarity that is unfolding. One form of precarity is the fear of being detained. One is, the fear of being identified. Second, the fear of second is the idea, the homogeneous labeling of everyone as Burmese. Now, what does this say about our understanding of refugee issue in the context of Indo-Myanmar borderlands? One is that we are quite stuck with what in social science what we call methodological nationalism, where the idea is that the state is seen as a spatial container, that borders are fixed and there is a neat separation of states, and identity and belonging are fixed and static. Whereas in reality, identity and belonging are quite fluid, and the way in which it is expressed are not always static, but rather quite malleable and dynamic. Now, the first part of the case study, the narratives that I talk about, has to do with refugees who are currently residing in India. Now, I also wanted to talk about the experience of refugees who have migrated successfully to United States. So, a Mizo family residing in the United States migrated when the UNHCR opened applications for refugees from Myanmar. Now, many of these families have used India as a transit, and when interviewing them, their narrative speaks of the story of suffering, struggle, and resilience in camps in Malaysia, Japan, Thailand, discriminated against by the majority ethnic communities. Now, in asking about this route of migration, mostly refugees first migrated to Guam, which is a territory of the United States in the Pacific Ocean. And then from there, they were taken over to the mainland United States, largely in Maryland. So today, it is quite natural that Maryland has one of the largest population of Burma refugees, particularly belonging to the Chin and Mizo groups. So this is one narrative, that one narrative from a participant, whom I interviewed. I was in Aizawl for an economic business, selling pig, and then my relative, who was then settled in the US, informed me about the opening of applications for asylum. I rushed back to Myanmar and then prepared to travel to US. We first landed in Guam, where we were put up in one house of about 20 to 30 people. Then we find work and begin to settle. After a year, we were taken to United States. I have to hide my flight ticket from Bangkok to Guam in my shoes so as to avoid any arrests. And on the way in the airport, I lost all my belongings and arrived at Guam empty-handed. There were many who arrived in similar condition. Today, he has taken his two sons with him and now settled in a state in the US. Today, he is a Meso-American who have a legal American citizenship. Now, the final case study. So many of Mesoamericans have lived and spent at least 10 years of refugee life in Malaysia, India, and Thailand before being resettled to the United States or any other countries. Memories of life in Myanmar in camps in Malaysia or India are stories of the precarious existence of either not being a full citizens, faced with discrimination and exploitation in the hands of the host communities or state. Many celebrate the change of their passport, the red color Myanmar passport to holding the dark blue US passport cover. In social as well as religious gatherings, many of them remark, Le hasen kan le lai tha, kan le lai kan le thei na te, kan har sat na te, ngai to in ho in ang pichu ro pui tak ani. Really, really good in translating this. I thought I'll just put it in music. There is a concern about what is happening in Manipur, but there is no longing of the refugee past. So coming to my concluding thoughts. Now, today, because of the migration of Zou people in the United States or United Kingdom or Australia, we now have a very vibrant Zou diaspora, which is, possible because of the asylum and liberal policies that allow many Zou communities to escape violence and settle in different countries of the world. Second is, who is a refugee and who is entitled to asylum is a political question. The acceptance and rejectance of a community are contingent upon state attitudes, strategic and political interests, and its perception of the communities. Similar can be said of much of the civil societies. Now, among the Zou people, an important issue that often gets ignored or unattended is the issue of intergenerational violence. So intergenerational violence is an issue among Zou people, producing and reproducing all the new forms of precarity. The precarity experienced by contemporary refugees extends from a threat and security to their lives, the fear of being detained and deported, and the incessant labeling and racial profiling they are subjected to. So today, there is a renewed fear of statelessness among the Zou people, or a possibility of being made stateless. The last slide. Thank you so much for listening, and it is such a pleasure to be given this opportunity. Thank you all so much.